So my objectives for this session is that you'll be able to discuss key steps in designing effective PowerPoint slides, and that you'll be able to identify key steps in delivering a quality presentation. Um, so it's important to give credit where credit is due. A majority of the information that I have on this slides were taken from one of my colleagues. His name is Dr. McAvoy, and he prepared a talk. So I used a good number of his information. And then there's a TED talk given by David Phillips and I hope if you have time, you should go and listen to it. It's very fascinating. It's called Death by PowerPoint. So I've taken a lot of his lessons here in Liberty. Um, so that I'm giving credit to where I got my resources from. So remember, we went over the roadmap um, and how you want to walk your audience in your talk from where you're going to where you're finishing and so forth. That is an important aspect of your PowerPoint slides. So this topic is going to focus on two things. One is going to focus on the design and design aspects of a PowerPoint. The second is the delivery of your PowerPoint presentation. So let's talk about design. So here's a PowerPoint somebody created. What do you guys think about it? Dr. Gosa.
I think it is difficult to say. I mean, like it was having like a mixed font, and it was having just a destructive types, and it is difficult to focus on the PowerPoint.
Yeah, so this is an extreme example, right? Big picture in the center. You can't really see the things that are written in yellow. And then there's all sorts of images. And then there's black background and blue font and sentences. I mean, it's hard to figure out what to learn from this. You agree?
Yes.
Okay. How about this slide? Somebody else. Dr. Edosa, what do you think about this slide?
It's difficult to identify even each line and understand it.
I mean, you might as well read a book, right? It's just full of sentences, small font, a lot of material. So if somebody is talking to you, you're going to be reading and not paying attention to what they're saying. Okay. Good. Okay. How about this slide? Castada, what do you think?
It's over decorated.
You mean you don't like my fancy animation? It took me a long time to create that animation.
It's nice, but it's in excess.
So it's in excess, but more importantly, I agree with you, it's in excess, but more importantly, the animation is doing nothing to contribute to the message that you're trying to send. Okay? So these are three examples that and I intentionally chose extremes to make the points of it makes a difference on how you design your PowerPoint slides so that you can send the right message to your audience. Okay, so these are called 5 rules for design by David Phillips from Death by PowerPoint. So, rule number one is one message per slide. So here's an example. This was actually a slide that I had created before I learned all these things. So I'm talking about hypertension classification. There's essential hypertension and the risk factors for essential hypertension. Then there's secondary hypertension, medical cause, hints. So lots of information. So what would be best is to only have one message per slide. So how would I modify this slide? This is what I came up with. So I would start with, I'm going to talk about hypertension classification, and hypertension is classified into two, into essential and secondary hypertension. And I would go to another slide and say, now for essential hypertension, here are the risk factors. And I would talk about those risk factors before I introduce secondary hypertension and listing the causes for secondary hypertension. So ensuring that I only have one message per slide helps my audience listen to what I'm trying to teach them better. Okay? So rule number two, no sentences. Okay? So here's an example. Gallbladder. Somebody's trying to tell us about the gallbladder. So the gallbladder is a separate organ that is positioned on the inferior visceral surface of the liver. It stores bile secreted by the liver and releases bile into the duodenum after eating a fatty meal. So if you're the audience, you're either reading what's written here and not paying attention to what the presenter is saying. But what would be helpful would be if you just have bullet points that says location and function, the audience will quickly know that, okay, he's going to tell me something about location and he's going to tell me something about function. And as you're reading these keywords, I fill in the rest of the sentences for you. So it's highly recommended that instead of using full sentences, that you put bullet points and you as the presenter fill the rest of the words for your learner. Now, there's one exception that I use for this no sentences, and that's when you're mentioning your goals and objectives slides. And here's an example. And typically my goals and objectives slides, I state and I actually read them. So if I was presenting this, I would say, my objectives for this talk is to recognize that an EKG provides a graphic record of the electrical activity of the heart and so forth. So because I'm reading this and because I'm sharing it as an objective, it's okay to use a sentence in this instance. Rule number 3, 6 objects max per slide. Here's one of the slides that I used to talk about biventricular pacemaker. So it talks about cardiac desynchrony. It talks about what the cardiac desynchronization therapy provides for you, and it shows you an image of what the leads look like for biventricular pacemaker. And a good way to change this would be take the thing that's on the side, talk about the cardiac desynchrony, tell your audience what you're talking about, tell them about the leads. And then once you're done with that, then you can add the next set of information. And as you can see, I forced myself to cancel out at least 2 of the things that I'm talking about, just to maximize that. I'm not going to give you more than 6 things to think about in a slide. And people have done studies in terms of your brain and its ability to capture information. And when it's more than 6 things on the slide, it's much harder to capture information. Rule number 4, images. So I typically shoot for my figure to text ratio to be, in a ratio of 1 to 2 or more than that. And then in America, there's a saying that says a picture is worth 1,000 words. So you can, by just showing someone an image, you can save a lot of words and be able to convey a message better. And then somebody else added, say, if a picture is worth 1,000 words, then an animation is worth 10,000 words. So a properly done animation could even help you get your message across better. So here's an example for an image. So I'm going to talk about cardiac cycle. I can list all the different cardiac cycles for people to see. A better way to present that would be to actually have an image to show which valves are closed at what point of the cycle. And as you're discussing the different cardiac cycles with them, you can walk your audience with an arrow and showing them actually what happens in the heart, in the valves, and in the heart and ventricles. So like anatomy, and there's special things that are really better conveyed with using images. So check it. What does that mean? When I'm done with a PowerPoint slide, I group it and I take a snapshot. So this person has 47 slides and has maybe a couple of pictures, definitely not in a 1:2 ratio. As compared to this presentation, you can see that a majority of the slides have images. So when you're done with your PowerPoint presentation, it's a good habit to group them together, take a snapshot and say, do I have a good ratio of images to words? Okay. Rule number 5 is animation only when appropriate. Okay. So I've shown you the bad example of unnecessary animation, right? But I'm going to show you a good example of where an animation is helpful. So on this slide, someone is trying to show how we can inhibit or support the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. So you can put this image and then you can say, the first place where, my drug may act could be on the ACE inhibitor. And then the next place that our drugs will act in the renin-angiotensin aldosterone system is on these 3 positions, and that's where the diuretics act. And the combined action of these gives you, hypovolemia, hypokalemia, and loss of the RAS compensatory mechanism. So here's a good example of the good use of animation that helps an audience focus on the areas that you want to highlight on the image you have or something that you are speaking about. Okay, so in summary, 5 rules of design: 1 message per slide, no sentences, 6 objects max per slide, images, and animation only when appropriate. We've talked about design. Let's talk about delivering. And this is like 5 minutes. So I have 4 tips for you when you deliver a PowerPoint slides. The tip number 1 is you, not the slides. What that means is sometimes people are so focused on the slides, they are talking to the slides and not to the audience. So you need to engage the audience. Don't forget that your slides are your tools to help you connect with your presenters. It doesn't mean that you need to be absent. Okay? So, yes, the slides can help you get your message across, but you as a presenter needs to be engaging, needs to looking at people in their faces and communicating what you want to share. So when you deliver a talk, remember that you are important and you're the presenter and that you need to do the communication effectively. Okay, so that's tip number 1. Tip number 2 is know your slides. Be like a tape recorder. Rehearse your talk, especially when we give big talks, when we are invited to national meetings, grand rounds. We rehearse our presentation, see how long it takes, see what we need to cut out, figure out if there is a better way that we can say things. So do the same. Know your slides very well and practice your presentation. So that's tip number 2. Tip number 3 is manage your time. If you're given 15 minutes for a talk, 15 minutes, that's it. So don't have material for 30 minutes. and then you're going to lose your audience. You're going to lose the expectation. And the way you can know that you are within the time limits is if you do tip number 2, which is practice. Okay. Save time for questions. So if we're typically given a 30-minute presentation, we shoot for 25-minute presentation so that there's at least 5 minutes for people to ask questions. Because especially when you have students, you really want people to be engaged. You want people to process what you're teaching them or what you're sharing with them. And as they ask you questions and as you answer them, the learning will be a lot better, as opposed to you just doing all the talking and then they leave without getting an opportunity to answer their questions. Okay. Tip number 4, get feedback. I'll tell you, most of the major talks that I have given, I always run it by my mentors, show them my slides, share my slides with them, and feedback has helped shape my talks tremendously. So don't be offended if people tell you, oh, your presentation sucks. Don't be too proud not to say, oh, I can't get help from him. I can't get help from her. Trust me, having feedback and having people go over your presentations will definitely improve your presentations, their quality, and provides another set of eyes for what you're doing. Okay, so delivery tips: you, not the slides. Number 2, know your slides very well. 3, time it appropriately. And then 4, animation only when appropriate.